Hello and welcome to the second virtual talk in MISC Art Institute's 6-month series of conversations with leading arts industry experts. My name is Oliver Farrell. I am the Education Program Manager at MISC Art Institute, and I'm your host for this talk. What is contemporary art? Our speaker today is the artist Afra Al Dhaheri from Abu Dhabi. Al Dhaheri's work is a reflection of materiality, memory, and questioning the social constructs. Now, during this talk, we'll be discussing the rapidly changing cultural climate in Abu Dhabi, within the Emirates, and within the GCC. Now, Al Dhaheri is also an assistant professor in visual arts in the College of Arts and Creative Enterprises at Zayed University. That's also where she completed her undergraduate. And she holds an MFA in painting from Rhode Island School of Design. And today's talk will be recorded, and we'll upload the video to the MISC YouTube account. So throughout the talk, attendees are invited to ask questions, and we'll try and find some time at the end to answer some of these questions. Now, I would like to welcome our speaker, Afra. Hello.
Hi, thank you for the nice introduction.
No worries. Now, I suppose the question of the hour is, what is contemporary art?
Well, the definition that I guess we learned at school is like artists who are still practicing, or artists who are still living, or living artists. But I think living through the scene, contemporary art is also what contributes to the social conditions, the socio-political environment. I think contemporary art is what constitutes or kind of also addresses contemporary issues, so issues that we are currently undergoing. I look at contemporary art and think about all the artists that are making in my environment, in my surroundings. So yeah, I mean, I think we can go on and on to talk about who are contemporary artists and what is contemporary art, but I really do think that it's work and artists who deal with the day-to-day issues and kind of document what is happening as it is happening today.
So within your practice, how do you feel your practice sort of fits this definition of contemporary art?
I mean, I think in my case, I also talk a lot about personal experiences. I would do a lot of like back and forth, looking back at childhood experiences or developmental ideologies that were either inherent or socially kind of conditioned to grow up with, and respond to that, through exploration of materiality, developing material to kind of hold meaning, and kind of seeking meaning within these mediums as well, and mediums that are available to me today because of like their presence in my environment. Yeah.
So can you tell me a little bit more about your actual practice? So what mediums you're using? You talk about materiality, but how do your mediums sort of explore that materiality?
Yeah. So I started working a lot with plaster. I was interested in kind of exploring sculptural forms, and this was back in, let's say, 2012. I would produce sculptural forms and then draw them, study them in a way, experience them, or paint them. It started with that, but then furthermore, I also was constantly questioning myself and asking, like, why am I interested in this material? And this was a kind of a reoccurring question of like, why am I interested in this material? Or why is this material worthy of being an artwork? Or what is it suggestive of? And I did the Sheikh Salama Emerging Artist Fellowship, where I further explored that. And then when I moved to the States, there was one moment I remember being in San Francisco, and I opened the window and I saw a construction crane. And I remember calling on my friend and I'm like, come check this out. There's this construction crane. And I was so excited, like almost a kid who was like shown like a park or like, you know, surprised with candy or something. And I didn't realize like where that enthusiasm came from or excitement. And I kind of started to question that moment. And I looked at her, I'm like, and she asked me, she's like, why are you excited about a construction like crane? I'm like, that's a good question. So I kind of started unpacking that question and realizing that I was away from home. I was displaced or decontextualized from my context and from my environment and from my, like the visual environment that I was used to seeing and what is my landscape. And I realized that my landscape was construction. And I was constantly surrounded by construction. Growing up, having a lot of homes built around where I lived. And I realized that that moment was basically me being nostalgic to home and missing home, being homesick for construction, you know. And going back to the studio, I decided to go to hardware stores and see what I can find there and what I can introduce to my practice, and shifting from plaster. And there I kind of answered the question of why plaster, but I mean, it exists in our homes. Most rooms have like gypsum, ceiling skirtings and stuff. So it was kind of part of also my upbringing and understanding that material. And that's when I started, I moved to like working with cement. I introduced pipes, like steel pipes, and I would work with steel wires. In school, I learned how to cast in glass, and that's kind of like where the journey started of me using construction materials to actually address and talk about something rather more intimate, which is more of upbringing, social conditioning, and understandings of like social ideologies that I grew up with. And they were very prominent, they were very important part of my upbringing. So it's almost as if like addressing the interior using an exteriorly familiar material.
And so how has then rope sort of entered your practice? Because I know for the MISC Art Grant, this has been a major part of the actual materiality of your work.
Yeah. So the rope works actually started when I was doing my research for my first solo show that took place in Dubai of last year. And that body of work had to do with my research that revolved around hair and its connotations and representations within social constructs or cultural understandings, different cultures, different religions, and like the associations with hair and how hair kind of like holds different meanings. And I started initially by this whole research started by actually collecting my own hair and applying it to different surfaces such as paper and presenting it to the public and kind of like questioning the meaning of that and questioning how acceptable or not acceptable it was. And there was a lot of kind of also playfulness with this idea of like, what this is just a material, this is just a medium, but then further investigations, understanding that this material is really loaded and like charged culturally and has a lot of kind of intimate associations. I wanted, because my work predominantly was sculptural and like maybe installation based at times, my hands were itching. So I really wanted like this. It's interesting because when I made the works on paper, I was doing a residency in St. Ives, and I kind of gave myself these few set of rules where I'm like, Afra, you're just going to make works on paper. And I restricted myself. So I'm like, without my cement, without my molds and casts and all of that, without my hardware store, like, what can I make on paper? And those pieces came to life. But then, like, going back to my studio, I was like, okay, so now these are like very fragile, very tactile, and the material is very soft and fine. So like, how can I translate that into something that is sculpture, something that's three-dimensional in its form, still holds the same tactility and fragility, the visual contrast, but is actually still representing hair? And I started doing a lot of investigations of like going to the hardware store and buying everything that is like wavy or spiral, which kind of like associates to the form of my own hair. Not knowing what they actually do or what's the initial use of these materials, but I was just buying them and changing their context. And then when I do something with them, I would go back and be like, okay, so what are you actually used for? And yeah, so a lot of trials with different material, but there was a lot of like plastic, metal and such. And I was thrown off, honestly, because I really wanted an organic material. I realized in my investigation that I was more interested in something that is more organic, that can more associate to the human body. And I stumbled upon rope, started using rope as it is. I was not happy with the form. It felt like it was something nautical. And I started untwisting it. And that kind of like became an epiphany or an aha moment where I'm like, oh my God, like this is so laborious to actually just sit and untwist hair or untwist rope at that time. And then thinking of that laborious process made me also think of like the labor that is kind of encapsulated or kind of held within different homes of mothers, like dealing with their little girl's hair, or like women in their day-to-day practice of like just maintaining that body part, or like that is hidden. And only when I started treating the rope like hair and it started responding similarly, like for example, I'd braid it, keep it there for a couple of days, and then unbraid it, and it would hold the wave, it would hold the form, and it felt like it was actually functioning the same way that hair would respond to such treatments. And that's when I felt like, okay, I think you can actually represent hair. And it was a relief for me, because I felt like I have exhausted my resources to actually present this to my audience and say I am representing rope as hair.
Yeah. And it's an interesting medium to use, rope, because, and like you said, sort of you would buy something from the hardware store, take it home or take it to your studio and then practice with it. The idea of using rope, which especially within the GCC region, all these port cities have got a nautical identity, a nautical history, and the rope itself is so tied in with the idea of masculinity. And so to take what is actually a material that has got a very masculine or very male-dominated historical function, and then to reapply a female message to it in terms of the tradition of women, you know, braiding hair or looking after the hair of their daughters. It's quite an interesting mix you've got going on within the practice. But you're also using these mediums, which are quite big mediums to work with. They're not a small practice, you know. So for you within Abu Dhabi, could you tell me a little bit about where your studio is, and how you found accessing studio spaces within the city?
Yeah, so my first studio was actually part of a collective that I started with a group of artists, and it was called Bait 15. And we had rented a villa where it kind of became home to a group of studios. And then we had like a multifunctional space where sometimes we'd host residencies or exhibit and so on. That we ran that space for 5 years, and then we kind of like, the walls were getting tighter and we all needed more space and bigger spaces. So we collectively made the decision to close the space down and kind of start another chapter where we would like set examples of like what we called serious production spaces. And for me, that was always dreaming of having like a warehouse studio, which I actually rented 5 months ago. So I just moved into a warehouse in Musaffah, which is an industrial area actually. But it's very convenient for me because it's close to where I live. But it kind of like, it's this new space, 10-meter high ceiling. I have walls that extend like 20 meters by 14. And so it became, the first piece I made in that space was actually the Musk grant piece. I had just moved there and we were still installing AC in the space, and I had to actually produce that work. No AC in September. but it was a space, it was definitely an adventure, but you know, it shows, I think, that the importance of what I'm making. I really believed in the space, I believed in the work. It had to be done regardless of the circumstances. And yeah, it is laborious and it's huge. And I think that this new space would present more, maybe bigger opportunities for me to work and experience scale. And one of the things that also encouraged me to have a space like that was my first large-scale rope work that was Srihah, that was part of the Beyond Emerging Artists Commission's part of Abu Dhabi Art Fair. It was a 6-meter high piece and extended on a like 10-meter diameter. And when I made it in the space, I made it in the villa where the first studio. So we made it in parts and we prepped all the ropes and everything to be installed in the space. So when we started installing it in the space, I looked at it and it just felt like it wanted to expand, and the space allowed for it. And I was like, oh my God, like this came to life in this form. I mean, we planned the top coming down and everything, but the extension of the 10-meter diameter was later on a decision to kind of like respond to the space that it existed in. And I was thinking that like, if this was a decision based on like a 3-hour like decision making, and I was able to produce or to make that decision, then what would happen if I had a space to make of that scale and have room to like do a lot of like trials and errors and like testing and such. And that kind of like really pushed me to move forward with getting a bigger space.
Definitely. And within Abu Dhabi now, are there other artists who are in warehouses? Are there other artists that you know of who are in similar situations?
I don't at the moment, but I'm hoping I attract more artists. Well, I convinced a ceramic studio who just moved next to me, so.
Yeah, I did see you loading a kiln on your Instagram recently.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about what that was for?
So those are actually new works that I'm working on producing. They're ceramics. I still don't know where they're going, what's happening with them, because it's really experimenting with form. So I'm pushing the hair narrative work further, and I'm kind of like focusing on exploring the forms of hair and the forms that it creates. So I've been literally just extruding clay. We have a ceramic facility at the university, so I've been utilizing that. And I would like extrude different shapes and forms of the clay. And it's kind of a similar process to also, again, going back to ceiling skirtings that exist in walls, and that's usually how they make them. They would like cast them, and in other forms in vernacular architecture, in like South America, where they would actually extrude clay in that form to become that ceiling skirting. And so I've utilized that method to extrude these forms, and then I would shape them and curl them at times and kind of like create waves of them. And they end up being these like ceramic objects of like either lines or noodles.
And this kind of comes back. This kind of comes back.
My nephew is saying noodles.
The noodles. This kind of comes back, I suppose, to your practice, though, which talks around social conditioning and creating the mold and fitting the mold, and sort of that sort of production of society, I suppose, when you've got really clear, defined borders. What is the product of it? And where you are in the world is a really fascinating place. I'm not, for our attendees today, the United Arab Emirates just recently changed their weekend from a Friday weekend to a Saturday weekend, from Friday weekend to a Saturday weekend to now a Saturday and Sunday weekend. So it's definitely a changing place to sort of fit into a changing population of the Emirates. And I suppose you, as an artist who is from the city of Abu Dhabi, whose heritage is from that place, you're expected to really keep up, to keep pace. And do you feel like your practice is really informed by this shift that's happening culturally?
100%. I mean, my initial research when I was at grad school was basically how to adapt to a fast-moving city and how to adapt to the pace of this change that we're constantly undergoing. And in further kind of like examining this idea and trying to understand like how do we respond to it, or how do we coexist with change at that pace. I've come to realize that one thing that captured my attention was the span of our memory, and how like the span of memory became shorter. It became very evident that personally, I would have much more vivid memories of my childhood than like of last week or last month. And I've been like, and every time I talk to someone about this, they're like, yeah, you're right. Actually, we don't remember things as vividly as we used to. And I mean, obviously technology, our iPhones, and like access to tremendous amount of information at once, and like all this overlapping contributes to that. But it's also that everything is shifting. So I started looking back at like childhood places, where playgrounds I used to play in, or like places that my parents would take me, and they no longer exist as a result of the developing city. They were either demolished, replaced, and such. So now there's more awareness of like preservation of architectural spaces, preservation or like appreciation to these spaces, but a lot have already gone. And so how do you hold on to a place? I mean, as humans, we always kind of have this need to feel belonging, to associate ourselves with a small piece of land or home or space. And when that is not tangible, it becomes, I think, very disorienting in a sense. And I think that in my research, I was looking more in terms of how does it affect the memory. And that's kind of what it led me to explore the processes that I'm exploring right now. And my kind of ultimate goal was how to slow down my everyday experiences in order to be able to register these moments in my memory more vividly.
Yeah, because I can't imagine myself coming from a place like Australia, which is so expansive in space. You know, we really we all grew up with the backyard and, you know, these streets that we could walk down, and coming into spaces here in the GCC where it is such construction upon construction of these cities, holding memory is really, I can see, could be quite tricky, because the whole entire cityscape changes so rapidly, and also culturally changes so rapidly.
Yeah.
So kind of bringing us into 2022, how has COVID been for you and your practice? You know, this sort of post, I mean, are we post-COVID yet? I'm not sure. But, I don't know. But this sort of, since we've had this pandemic, I know a lot of artists really pivoted for an online practice, and to move more into basing themselves on the digital space. You expanded, you went to a larger studio, you went to a warehouse. How do you feel your practice sort of fits into the current narrative, the current dialogue of contemporary art that's happening globally?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, I really like the physical experiences that I have with my work. And I like making by hand. I look back a lot at like crafts that were practiced by my grandmother, by my mother, and a lot of those practices sometimes feed or find their way into my work and into my practice. And I just feel like that it's tough for me to look at my practice digitally. I don't see myself doing that. I mean, we've looked at forms of like documenting processes or documenting productions of works. Sometimes I got comments asking me whether I'm interested to present, for example, the making process as a performative act of the production of the work, because it plays a major role. Like my work is process-based, so sometimes the process is more important than the actual result. But in many cases, the work that I produced at MISC, the work that I produced prior to that, and all these big rope pieces, I actually consider the audience after the work is finished. Like, I want the audience to think about how long it took to make this. I want people to question like the weight of it. I want people to question the kind of labor that went into creating such work. And I think that it's something that becomes like almost absent from our mind. We don't think about scrolling through our phones, through all these different artworks and galleries and shows and like presentations and such. We become almost like desensitized to texture, to feeling. So like we almost like put our senses to sleep. And I was reading a book that was very instrumental to my solo show. It's called Eyes of the Skin by Johanny Palazma. He's an architect, but he talks a lot about how we've become an ocular-centric society and heavily dependent on our sight as the dominant of our senses and ignoring everything else. And when I was making, I was reading a part in the book where he talks about the experience of a person walking into the forest and how invigorating to the senses that is. You leave revitalized and like energized, not knowing why, but it's actually because like the sun rays pass through the trees and like caressed your skin and you know, and your skin was able to like smell and hear and actually experience your surroundings. And I feel like with everything that's happening with COVID and how it kind of gave us this shift into the online world, there's a lot of like pros that come with that, but there are also a lot of cons. And I think because I teach, I think that a lot of the resources became more accessible to students, and I think that's fantastic. I think that it brought them access to more resources, more content and such, but at the same time, it really like compressed our time, it compressed our lives, they like blurred the lines between work and home ethics, or like home and kind of like self maintenance. And I think that that's problematic. And I try to like separate between my studio and my home, although I'm in my home right now, but like it's late. I don't stay in the studio this late. I usually am working in the morning. But yeah, so I think that in my case, just to wrap up this question and answer it for you, I think that my practice was kind of resisting the push to the online platform. And I wanted to present my viewers with an even more haptic experience.
Definitely. And I think that kind of the COVID experience sort of feeds into this thing of memory. And I think that the online platform can sometimes really detract from memories of experiences, because the online is something that we access continuously. You know, it's on our phone, it's, you know, at work, it's in our homes. We're sort of always on devices every waking minute. The material of physical sculpture and installations and even exhibition spaces, there is something about that ability to remember your experiences when you go places and when you go and see an exhibition, when you go and see an artwork, and you can kind of remember the day that surrounds it, the feeling that it gave you. And so I'm glad to hear that you as an artist still hold the importance in that, because I think that there's still a lot of importance around the physical exhibition, the physical work. And that doesn't at all detract from the importance of what the online spaces offer us, because I think that the online spaces are also incredible in terms of accessibility and global accessibility to art from all over the world, or conversations from all over the world.
100%.
Yeah. So coming back, we'll sort of come back to, what is contemporary art for you? So within your city, Abu Dhabi, how do you see contemporary art sort of functioning?
I mean, I think it's great. You can see that, I mean, given that I teach at Zayed University, we've seen like tremendous shift and kind of like flood in a positive way in the numbers of students that's been kind of registering and joining the art college. So I do see like a lot of shift happening and a lot of development in the numbers of artists, in the kind of, there's a really interesting energy that is kind of taking over the scene right now. There's a lot of motivation. I think there's a lot to do in terms of like programming, joining, we have a few residency programs that exist now. So I think that there's a really interesting pulse at the moment where artists are encouraged to like study, but then also actively practice art. I've had a few students who started a collective and studio spaces similar to what we have developed as Beat 15, and that's fantastic. I think to see that taking place, I think there's a lot of it only puts us here waiting for like what work would they make, and anticipating very excitingly, you know, to be part of a scene that is active, opinionated, constructive, and all of that.
It's so good to hear that there's an ecosystem then starting, because Abu Dhabi is sort of known now for being the sites of these really large institutions. You've got the Louvre, and you've also got the Guggenheim, and they can be sort of monoliths globally, and can be quite inaccessible for people who don't necessarily have an arts background or an arts practice. And so often it's the people who are from the space that are driving not only, you know, an art scene, but also arts education for the people there. So it's great to hear that from your
100%.
original studio at Beat 15, that you've then had all these other different artist-run initiatives kind of starting up, and that you are part of this next generation of teachers as an assistant professor in visual arts. helping to educate within the region. When you went through your undergraduate, was there art studies, like visual arts studies in Abu Dhabi?
There wasn't actually. So I was the third cohort of arts, and it was part of the Arts and Humanities department at the time. So we weren't even separately a college. But there was interior design and graphic design. There wasn't enough students to open a visual arts program. So I actually ended up doing graphic design and then taking, I remember there were like 3 concentration courses that I needed to take to actually tick the box that I have a major, and I took everything else in visual arts.
Absolutely.
But the year after me, they started actually the visual arts program. I'm like, why?
But it's great that they've got it now, you know, that it has.
No, I think it's fantastic. Yeah, and we have, I mean, they moved to, I was in an older campus as well. It was an actually high school campus that was turned into the university. And now they, like 2 years after I graduated, actually, they moved into the new campuses, and they have fantastic facilities. And we have a printmaking facility, we have photography facility, ceramics, just really great. And you see it in the results, in the works that the students are producing. You see that they have access to resources that are rich, that are really helping them produce the work that they're producing today. But also going back to what you said in terms of like the kind of what the online kind of platform adds to us, I think that also access to a lot of art online helped develop how our students look at works, how they kind of think about their ideas, develop their concepts and all of that. So I think in general, this is a really good time for, you know, artists to be and exist and practice.
And do you feel like socially within Abu Dhabi or within the Emirates that being an artist as a career is viable? Do you feel like that socially the society is at the place where they see the career of an artist as being a viable career?
I mean, it's tricky. But I think that we're moving towards a much more brighter way of looking at it. I mean, when I changed my major and I wanted to study art, I was asked, like, what would you work? What would your job be? Like, what is there to, like, what would you work as, basically? And I remember I used like the graphic design trick. I'm like, every company needs a graphic designer. I'll be a graphic designer. But I never liked graphic design. Just so it's not for me. But you know that it's very interesting. Again, there still are a lot of parents worried for their kids, or to think about and consider, like, what career would you have, and what. And it's a valid, I think, argument, because, you know, artists all around the world, you know, you ask, how do you make money? I don't know. We don't make money until you make money. And it is a tough job. It's a commitment, and it's driven by passion. You have to really be committed. You have to know what you're getting yourself into. But I think that the presence of institutions now, we have in Abu Dhabi the Cultural Foundation, we have Department of Culture and Tourism, obviously the Louvre, Guggenheim coming up, and Zayed National Museum coming up. I think the presence of all of these institutions really allowed parents to, like, feel more safe about their kids to actually go and join and develop an art career, I think having good examples of artists, I think the Ministry of Culture had been doing fantastic work kind of supporting and promoting the arts and culture career. So yeah, there's a lot. There's Warehouse 421 that offers a lot of like educational programming. So like, I remember one time, this was like about 3 years ago when I first started teaching, a student of mine told me, she's like, honestly, I was almost gonna give up and change my major because I was just didn't know what I can do. But now I saw you, and she's like, maybe I'll consider teaching. And I'm like, there's so much you can do. There's so much you can add. You can teach in schools. You can teach in, you know, higher education. There's so much to do. And I think that this mentality is slowly kind of loosening up and becoming more accommodating for this career. But at the end of the day, it's a valid concern. It's not easy to be an artist, and it's not easy to be a full-time artist. I mean, I teach, I technically have a full-time job. So I think being a full-time artist is just as challenging as anywhere in the world. But I do also think that we're probably fortunate that we're at a start of an ecosystem that's still thirsty. There's a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of support.
Absolutely. And I'm so excited to see where Abu Dhabi kind of goes now, especially with the Guggenheim and, as you said, these different artist-run initiatives that are starting up, and we've got fine arts majors coming out of the universities. It is absolutely ripe now for a scene to be happening. Now we're sort of at the 40-minute mark for our 1 hour talk. I'd like to really open it up to any of our attendees. If you would like to ask any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. I'll just put in a hello in case no one can see where the chat is. And if no one's got any questions, I'll be happy to keep on talking. So, Afra, what's next for you? What's coming up? We've talked a lot about what you've been working on in the past, and you say that you're sort of moving into ceramics and you're exploring the hair still. Have you got any solo exhibitions? Have you got group shows coming up? What are we going to see from you?
I mean, I have a few shows coming up. The one I can mention now is I'll be showing a few works in Art Dubai, which is coming up next month. No solo show scheduled yet, but making a lot of work. I'm looking forward to the summer, to be honest. I've applied to a few residencies, so hopefully get some time and space to go and kind of like, what I'm really interested in doing at the moment is like processing all the work. It's been a extremely fortunate 2 years of like almost making nonstop, and it's been fantastic, no complaints. But I just feel like it's important for every artist to take time to process what I have created and what I have made, to kind of like venture into a new project. And I'm naturally very productive, and I can't, like, it just, my making keeps me going. It's like a way of thinking, a way of like kind of decompressing and all of that. So I've been making these ceramics and they're accumulating in my studio. We'll see what the narrative about them is, but there's quite a bunch of them.
Which kind of actually feeds us then into one of the questions that we've got in our chat here from Shaima Shamsi. How has your exploration with your materials shaped your practice?
Interesting. I think that there's a lot of times where I've sought materials to kind of do certain things that I'm interested in, to find certain moments within materiality, whether it's, for example, to kind of show the vulnerability or the fragility of concrete or cement that is usually not associated to vulnerability. It's not usually associated to something that is fragile. So I kind of like push the material and try to kind of establish that. I think that the way that materials have shaped my work, I think it goes hand in hand. I've been exploring material, but then like materials kind of in the process of experimentation speak back to the meaning of what I'm creating, and almost like a two-way road of learning and teaching the material to exist in a certain way, but also learning from it. And I think that I don't know what other materials are there to, I think that there will be a lot of materials to be explored, but not stopping at one thing and always consistently trying to push and find what else the material can create. I think that's kind of how it shaped my practice. I don't think I'll stick to one material and associate myself with it, but it's a constant kind of exploration.
Well, it's a good place for us to go into Bader's question, which is, do you have a criteria for choosing materials?
I go to the hardware store first.
Love the way that's your choice, like that's your shop of choice, you know, like.
Yeah, I have good relationships with the hardware stores. So I would go to the hardware store first, but then a lot of times I would look around me and find, I mean, I've used porcelain teacups before. I've attempted to cast coat hangers, but using glass. So like, I would also look at objects that are familiar to me, that have particular associations, and then I would think about what could it represent. I mean, my most recent work where I created the Emirati pillows, takia, I made them in Expo with marble, and the choice for marble was because of its like historical association of monumentalizing objects and such, but then utilizing it to monumentalize a memory that lives within the collective society. And for it to exist in weather throughout. But then I recreated this, the pillow in an inflatable plastic material, PVC plastic. And it's basically an inflatable pillow, which you can use in the pool as well. But we made them for an art installation in an exhibition that's currently up in Manarat Saadiyat. It's called Zamanna. The idea of the exhibition was to explore memories of the 90s, and each artist would have a room to showcase kind of, or take back the audience into an experience. So I felt like that was a very playful way of putting it. I'm like, what of my work is like playful in that sense? And at the same time, I kind of felt like the 90s period is becoming like popularized, almost becoming like the new pop. So I'm like, what could I make that could kind of suggest that idea of trendiness and fit into this narrative that it's being created, particularly at this time? So like, how can this pillow become part of the contemporary run? And that's when I decided to turn it into a floaty. So like, fits every Snapchat, TikTok video.
And it reminds me of, I don't know if they were big here, but especially Australia in the late 90s, that sort of Aqua and Spice Girls era, it was the inflatable furniture.
Yeah, exactly.
The inflatable couches. And now, and there's another question here from Bader, which is it really important for the artist to have a degree in an art college?
That's a good question.
This is a very good question.
It's a very good question. It's going to get us into trouble now.
Yeah.
If my students are here, you shouldn't be listening to this answer. I mean, I think that it's subjective, to be honest. I know fantastic artists who've kicked off their career and they've become established through like self-learning and really engaging. And I think that one thing that I always say to many artists who come sometimes for me for advice is commitment. You need to commit and really commit to the sustainability of your practice, commit to your ideas, believe in your ideas, no matter how small, how big. really commit and be consistent in your practice. And consistency does not come only from using the same material or remaking and making a mark for yourself. That's nonsense. Consistency is about constantly producing and experimenting, exploring new ideas, pushing yourself, allowing yourself to be criticized and challenged. I think that's what makes up a good artist. I personally went and pursued my degree because I knew I wanted to teach. So that's something that you can't teach without a degree. And I also wanted to kind of immerse myself in a foreign ecosystem. I wanted to see what would I make if I was taken out of my context. I wanted to learn particular skills that I found where I studied. And yeah, so I think to answer your question, I don't think it's important for you to be an artist, but it might be important for you to teach or pursue a career, maybe in education or such. Unfortunately, it's very unfortunate, but unfortunately, the Western kind of institutions have kind of placed this idea of artists being qualified based on how many residencies or how many reputable schools they've been to. But I think that this is kind of breaking down a little bit. It's not as bad as it used to be.
And that's it. I don't think that an artist needs to have a piece of paper qualification that says, you know, I went to art school, therefore I can say I'm artist. Unlike, say, an electrician or a plumber where they've got a trade and they need to be licensed. I think what the art school offers, though, is, like you said, that really important thing, which is time and space to experiment your practice and practice and be open to criticism and to explore ideas to the furthest point. And what an art degree offers you is a centralized place to do that, where you've got mentorship, where you've got critique, where you've got peers and colleagues, and you've also got an access then to materials and techniques and experts who can teach you these materials and techniques. And so the art school, you know, it does offer these things, but it also has this, you know, exactly the qualification out the other end, which isn't necessarily the goal. And you don't always have to go to art school to have all of those wonderful things. You can find them in artist residencies, or you can find them also in artist-run initiatives. I know of artist-run initiatives that also run their own masterclass and workshops for the artists who are within those studio spaces. And other institutes are out there, such as Misgard Institute, where we've got educational programming that hopefully will inform artist practice. And I think that we had an interesting talk a couple of weeks ago in Riyadh at the Adria Biennial, and we had Hans Ulrich come with a few other curators from major institutions within the US and within the UK, and talking about art school, especially in the context of Saudi Arabia, where there isn't this sort of fine art school degree. You know, do we need one? Do we not need one? You know, is it a curse to have the art school because we spend all this time trying to break the habits that are formed? You know,
I think that something that is very unique to this region is what, let's say, an artist who's self-taught in the States would have, or let's say in Europe would have, that we did not have, is the museums, the institutions that offer like access to actually see historical works, see artworks, whether contemporary, and that's an education, you know. Having access to see artworks in person is an education. Having access to see galleries, to see works is an education. And we did not have that for the longest time. I mean, I grew up in Abu Dhabi, and we had 2009, we had Art Paris, which then was changed into being called Abu Dhabi Art. And that was our fair. And I realized that our understanding even of an art fair is not the same as the commercialized understanding of an art fair in the Western world. When I went to the States and I was telling people like, oh, let's go to Freeze, or let's get there. Why do you want to go to Freeze? It's like, this is bad. It's like where artworks get commodified, and this is like the worst part of our practice, and like it's the commercial side. And I'm like, what do you mean? And I came from a place where Abu Dhabi art was the place where I had access to see art. It's my only resource. And so it was very important part, and it still plays that role. So going to art fairs here is not the same. And they become this like institutional kind of education offering space.
Yeah.
And I think that's why there becomes a need for educational institutions or fine art programs, because we don't have enough institutions or resources that can take the place of the art school. Yeah.
I'm so glad to hear that, though, that you also see the importance of these sort of art galleries and museums and spaces as sites of education, because they are public resources in many regards. You know, there are spaces for population to go and to think, and to coming back to the original question, what is contemporary art? You know, and that contemporary art is, at least for the way I see it, is the artist's ability to make a comment or to have a dialogue about contemporary issues through their medium. And I think that you've spoken about this before, about the importance of dialogue through the practice, which leads us then into our very, very last question for our talk with Afra Al Dhaheri today. This one is, I'm curious about any rituals or habits when you are in the studio. Is there anything about
I water my plants to start the day. I water my plants to start the day. I like to work in the morning. So sometimes when I'm on a deadline or know that I have a project where I really, really, really need to produce and be productive, I would literally try and wake up 5 a.m. in the morning or 6 a.m. and get to the studio as soon as possible. I'd have my coffee, I'd sit. I usually start with like reading a page or two from any of my books that I currently read. And that's become helpful. I read a lot of essays on different topics. I have a lot of the Whitechapel gallery documents of contemporary art books. So they come in, like each book would be, for example, there's a book on destruction. So it's a collection of essays on destruction, either by artists or by writers and critics and such, or surveying artists' practices. So I read a lot of those. And I would start with anything, to be honest. I saw a question about where do you start? I start with anything. Sometimes when I don't know what to do in the studio, I would just coat surfaces or hang things, organize the space, anything. But I would not leave the space or not go to my studio if I know that I don't have much to do, or there's no idea sparking my head today, and I would go. I think that is the ritual, is to actually be present, is to go to the studio. Even if I just go and water my plants, I go to the studio, build up that energy in the space, keep the momentum going. Even if I'm not making, I have to go to the studio.
Amazing. I think that is one thing that I would also like to encourage when I'm talking to young and emerging artists who are in their practice, or even not even just young, but emerging artists in their practice, is the ritual is you just going and sitting with it and trialing stuff and researching, and it's that thing of going and being in the space, which also helps you then find the momentum. You know, it's that contextualization of it. Amazing. That's our time. Afra, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you to all our attendees as well for tuning in. As I said, this will be posted onto the MISC Art Institute YouTube, and it'll be accessible also on our website. So thank you very much. And
thank you.
Until next time. Bye-bye now.
Bye.